In the deepest corners of Africa, where daylight fears to tread, something impossible was discovered. A pride of lions, thriving not under the golden African sun, but in absolute, suffocating darkness. For decades, scientists believed such a thing could never exist. Lions are creatures of the savannah, built for sunlit hunts and moonlit roars across endless plains. But what researchers found in the limestone caves of the Congo Basin would shatter everything we thought we knew about these apex predators and force us to ask a terrifying question: what else is living in the dark that we don't know about? Before we unveil the shocking truth about this underground pride, if you love mysteries that will challenge everything you believe about nature, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what comes next will haunt you. Now let's descend into the darkness and discover the most incredible and terrifying discovery in modern wildlife research. The story begins not with a roar, but with silence. In 2019, a team of cave explorers and wildlife researchers embarking on an expedition into the Kasai region of the Democratic Republic of Congo had set out to map an unexplored cave system. Their mission was simple: to document the geological formations and catalog any wildlife that might inhabit these underground chambers. The lead researcher, Dr. Marcus Okonkwo, was a renowned speleologist who had spent 20 years exploring caves across Africa. He thought he had seen everything the underground world had to offer, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what awaited in the deepest chamber of the Mvuli cave system. The expedition descended over 2 hours into the earth. Their headlamps cut through the absolute blackness like thin blades, revealing stalactites that hung like the teeth of some ancient beast. The air grew colder with each meter of descent, dropping from a comfortable 20 degrees to just 8 degrees Celsius. The walls glistened with moisture, covered in a thin layer of slime and fungi that had never known sunlight. It was an alien world, untouched by the sun's warmth, untouched by the natural rhythms that govern life on the surface. The team had explored 15 different chambers without incident, documenting mineral formations and cataloging blind fish in underground lakes. And then Dr. Okonkwo heard it, a sound so unexpected in these depths that he initially thought his mind was playing tricks. A low rumble, deep and resonant, echoing through the cavern like distant thunder trapped underground. The sound made every member of the team freeze. Their guides, experienced Congo natives who had explored these caves before, immediately went pale. One of them whispered something in Lingala, his native language, that Dr. Okonkwo would later learn meant the death that breathes. The team paused for 16 minutes, their lights scanning the darkness ahead, and then they saw it. Reflections. 2 pairs of reflections caught in their lamp beams, glowing with that unmistakable eye shine that only predators possess. Large reflections, predator reflections. The team's instruments showed the animals were approximately 40 meters ahead, in a chamber that hadn't been mapped on any previous expedition. Dr. Okonkwo's hands trembled as he adjusted his equipment. He had spent 2 decades studying caves, but in all his years he had never documented large predators living in permanent darkness. It wasn't supposed to be possible. Mammals of this size needed the sun, they needed the surface. But as the team slowly, cautiously advanced, the truth began to reveal itself in ways both magnificent and terrifying. As the expedition moved forward, their lights revealed more reflections. Not just 2 pairs of eyes, but many, 6, 7, 8. The team's thermal cameras registered the shapes of massive bodies, moving with the fluid grace of apex predators. One creature rose to its full height, and Dr. Okonkwo's instruments measured it at over 2 meters tall, a lioness. There was no doubt. The shape, the movement, the way it carried itself despite never having seen the sun. It was a lion, and it was not alone. What emerged from the darkness over the next 20 minutes was something that would take the scientific community months to accept as real. A complete pride of lions, approximately 14 individuals, living deep within the cave system. But these were not normal lions. Months of subsequent research and analysis revealed adaptations so profound, so shocking, that they suggested these animals had been living underground for not just years, but potentially generations, perhaps centuries. The pride consisted of adults and juveniles, males and females, suggesting this was a stable, reproducing population. The younger lions showed characteristics that would have taken decades to develop, indicating that this underground habitation was not a recent phenomenon born from forced circumstances, but rather an established, evolved state. The most disturbing discovery came from examining the physical characteristics of the pride. Their eyes, illuminated by the team's lights, appeared far larger than normal lions, with pupils that had dilated to extraordinary sizes, allowing them to capture even the faintest light in the absolute darkness. But there was more. Their fur had changed. It was noticeably lighter, almost ghostly white in the team's flashlight beams. The pigmentation had drained away, leaving them looking almost albino, though not quite. It was as if the darkness itself had bleached them, turned them into phantoms of their surface-dwelling cousins. Their manes, where present, were thin and sparse compared to normal lions, suggesting that the evolutionary pressure of living in darkness had reduced the need for the elaborate displays that surface lions use to establish dominance. Most chillingly, their hearing appeared to be enhanced. The cave echoed with their vocalizations, complex patterns of sound that seemed almost language-like, far more sophisticated than the typical lion roar or growl. The team's instruments detected echolocation patterns in their calls, a trait that should have been impossible in such large animals. Yet the data was undeniable. These lions, over millions of years of evolutionary adaptation, had developed a sensory system that allowed them to navigate and hunt in absolute darkness. They had evolved beyond their surface cousins in ways that suggested not adaptation, but transformation. Dr. Okonkwo later wrote in his private journal, "We have not simply discovered a new population of lions, we have discovered what might be a different species entirely." And the implications are terrifying because it raises a single unavoidable question. If this is possible, what else is possible? What other impossible things are living in the darkness beneath our feet? The hunt became the next major discovery. The expedition team, maintaining a distance of at least 30 meters from the Pride, observed their behavior for 6 days before having to return to the surface to resupply. What they documented was predatory behavior refined to near perfection. The lions hunted using echolocation and thermal sensing, abilities that their surface cousins simply did not possess. In one documented instance, the Pride attacked a colony of cave-dwelling bats, coordinating their assault through vocalizations that the researchers' instruments suggested conveyed tactical information. One lion would drive the bats toward a particular section of the cave ceiling, where others waited. The precision of the hunt suggested communication at a level far more complex than normal lion behavior. They were not simply reacting to prey, they were planning, coordinating, executing strategies. It was hunting perfected by darkness itself. The prey availability in the cave system was astounding. Blind fish, cave crickets, species of bats that lived nowhere else on Earth, and most importantly, a population of cave-dwelling mammals that resembled large rodents but measured over a meter in length. These creatures, living their entire lives in darkness, had become the primary food source for the Pride. 1 week into the observation, the team witnessed something that would later be described as the most disturbing moment of the entire expedition. The Pride brought down one of the large cave mammals, a creature that weighed approximately 30 kilograms. The kill itself was efficient and quick, but what followed was not. The lions did not immediately feed. Instead, they surrounded the corpse and began a ritualistic behavior that the researchers had no precedent for in lion behavior. They made sounds, complex vocalizations that seemed almost ceremonial. They circled the body. They touched it with their noses in what appeared to be a form of collective acknowledgement. For 17 minutes, the entire Pride engaged in this ritual before beginning to feed. Dr. Okonkwo's interpretation was chilling. They are mourning, not the death of this specific creature, but acknowledging the cycle of survival. They understand, at some level, the transaction they are engaging in. Predator takes prey. Life sustains life. It suggests a level of consciousness we have barely begun to understand. The behavior was unlike anything documented in normal lion prides, where feeding was a chaotic, competitive affair with little ceremony. But the darkness held more secrets. On the 8th day of observation, the team's motion sensors detected activity in an adjacent chamber they had not yet explored. Dr. Okonkwo and 2 colleagues carefully made their way toward the disturbance, maintaining strict silence and minimal light. What they found would become the moment that transformed this expedition from fascinating into absolutely terrifying. The chamber was a nursery. At least 8 lion cubs, ranging from what appeared to be newborns to animals perhaps 2 months old, were resting on a bed of cave soil mixed with plant material that suggested intentional construction of a den. The cubs were blind, their eyes still fused shut in the way of newborn lions, but they were moving with purpose, their tiny bodies writhing and pushing against each other in a complex social dance that suggested they were communicating through touch and sound. in ways that surface cubs never needed to develop. Around the nursery, 3 lionesses maintained constant watch, their massive forms casting shadows in the researchers' light that seemed to swallow the chamber itself. These were not merely lions living in darkness, they were lions that had adapted so completely to darkness that the surface world would kill them. The discovery of the nursery changed everything. What had begun as an expedition to document cave formations had become something far more significant and deeply unsettling. The team realized they were not simply observing a population of lions that had adapted to cave life. They were witnessing the evolution of a completely separate branch of lion development, one that had diverged so significantly from surface lions that interbreeding might now be impossible. The implications cascaded through the scientific community like an earthquake through sediment. Over the following days, the expedition documented the cubs' development with meticulous precision. What became immediately apparent was that these young lions possessed abilities that surface cubs would not develop for months, if at all. The newborns, despite having sealed eyes, were already responding to echolocation patterns emitted by adult lions. Their ears twitched and oriented toward sound sources, with an accuracy that suggested a sensory system calibrated for a lightless world. When one of the lionesses made a specific vocalization, a short, sharp clicking sound, every single cub in the chamber responded immediately by adjusting their position slightly to the left. It was not random movement. It was responsive. It was trained. It was a language being taught in darkness, passed from generation to generation in the depths of the earth. Dr. Okonkwo's colleague, Dr. Amara Nunkomo, a behavioral biologist, documented the interaction on video. She later described it as the moment she understood we were not observing evolution in progress. We were observing intelligence adapting to impossible circumstances. These cubs were not simply being born into darkness. They were being educated in it, prepared for a life in absolute blackness, by mothers and aunts who had mastered that existence so completely that light itself would be alien to them. The team conducted their first comprehensive physical examination of a deceased adult male lion on day 9 of the expedition. The animal, an estimated 8-year-old with a scarred face and partial mange covering his shoulders, had died from what appeared to be internal bleeding, possibly from a territorial dispute or a failed hunt. The necropsy revealed shocking biological modifications that science had thought impossible in such a short evolutionary timeframe. The lion's brain had undergone significant reorganization. The visual cortex, the region responsible for processing sight, had been partially repurposed to process acoustic and thermal information. The structural changes suggested that whatever evolutionary pressure had driven these lions underground had done so gradually enough that genetic changes could accumulate, but recently enough that the transformation was still incomplete. The lion's skeletal structure showed signs of calcium redistribution, with bones becoming denser and heavier, suggesting adaptation to constant subterranean pressure. The muscle fiber composition was entirely different from surface lions, with a far higher percentage of slow-twitch fibers designed for sustained activity rather than explosive bursts. These were not lions sprinting across savanna to catch gazelle. These were hunters designed for endurance in darkness, for prolonged stalking of cave-dwelling prey. But the most disturbing discovery came from the blood work. The samples showed abnormally high hemoglobin levels, suggesting adaptation to lower oxygen environments. The respiratory system had evolved to extract oxygen more efficiently from the thin air of deep caves. The digestive system showed radical changes, with an expanded stomach capacity and different enzyme distributions, suggesting a diet of cave-dwelling creatures that were completely alien to the African savanna. In every measurable way, these were no longer truly lions. They were something else. Something new, something that should not exist but did. The team's geological surveys revealed that the cave system was far more extensive than previously believed. What they initially thought was a single interconnected system was actually a vast network of chambers stretching for nearly 40 kilometers underground. Thermal imaging suggested that at least 7 different chambers showed signs of recent lion activity. The pride was not confined to a small space. They had an entire underground world to roam. The implications were staggering. If one pride of adapted lions existed, how many others might be living in the darkness? Subsequent expeditions to other parts of the cave revealed hunting grounds that suggested a stable, thriving ecosystem. The lions were not starving, not struggling. They were thriving. The population density they observed suggested the underground world was sustaining predators and prey in perfect balance, a self-contained ecosystem that had evolved independently from the surface world for who knew how long. Radiocarbon dating of lion skeletal remains found scattered throughout the cave system suggested occupation for at least 800 years. Some of the older remains suggested occupation for as much as 2,000 years. 800 years, 2,000 years. These lions had not recently adapted to cave life. They had been living in darkness for centuries, potentially for longer than human civilization had existed in the region. The local populations near the cave entrance had legends, stories passed down through generations of the death that breathes, creatures that lived in the darkness and occasionally emerged to hunt surface animals near cave openings. The indigenous peoples had known, somehow, on some level, the legends and stories of the region had preserved this knowledge, even as modern science insisted such things were impossible. Dr. Okonkwo returned to the surface on day 11 of the expedition, his team carrying the first physical evidence of the underground lions, tissue samples, video documentation, thermal imaging data, and audio recordings of vocalizations that would revolutionize the understanding of lion behavior. The initial response from the scientific community was skepticism bordering on dismissal. Other researchers suggested equipment malfunction, misidentification, even hoax. The idea that large predators could evolve in such a short time frame, developing such radical adaptations, was considered scientifically impossible. But the evidence was irrefutable. DNA analysis confirmed beyond any doubt that these were lions, Panthera leo, but lions with genetic markers indicating a divergence from known surface populations approximately 8 to 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years, the last ice age. There was a theory emerging. What if some population of lions, perhaps chased by climate shifts or changing prey availability, had ventured into cave systems? What if, over 12,000 years, they had adapted so completely to underground life that they became something entirely different? What if, in the depths of Africa, an entirely separate branch of Panthera leo had evolved? The implications became more terrifying as the research continued. If lions could evolve such radical adaptations in 12,000 years, what did that suggest about evolution in general? It suggested that the timescales science had long assumed for major evolutionary changes might be wrong. It suggested that given the right pressures, animals could transform far more rapidly than previously believed, and most terrifyingly, it suggested that nature was far more creative, far more capable of producing the impossible than human science had given it credit for. The second expedition, mounted just 3 months after the first discovery, brought with it more sophisticated equipment and a larger team. They carried genetic sequencing equipment, advanced thermal imaging, audio analysis software, and even a small submersible drone to explore the underground water systems that connected various chambers. What they discovered expanded the mystery exponentially. The underground ecosystem was not confined to land. The water systems teemed with life, most of it visible, which was shocking because most cave fauna is extremely simple. But these waters contained complex ecosystems with predators and prey, with fish that had adapted to absolute darkness, with creatures that seemed to exist nowhere else on Earth. Most significantly, they found evidence that the lions hunted in water, not just that they ventured into water to drink, but that they actively hunted aquatic prey. The examination of a lioness's stomach contents revealed the remains of large blind fish, some measuring nearly half a meter in length. The lions had adapted to be aquatic predators, something completely unknown in the behavior of surface lions. They had diversified their hunting strategies, exploited every possible prey source, and built a civilization of predation so complete that they had eliminated any competitor that might threaten their dominance. One of the most profound discoveries came from a behavioral observation on day 5 of the second expedition. The team documented what appeared to be tool use. A lion, attempting to hunt a colony of cave bats that roosted on a ceiling too high for a direct leap, had retrieved a long piece of cave coral, a hard mineral formation that had broken free from the ceiling. The lion held the coral in its jaws and repeatedly struck the cave wall below the bats, creating loud vibrations that panicked the colony into flight. As the bats descended, other lions waited below to strike. It was not obvious intelligence. It was not human-level tool use. But it was something never before documented in lions: the ability to recognize a problem, identify a tool, and modify behavior to solve that problem. It suggested that the darkness was not merely selecting for physical adaptations, it was selecting for intelligence. It was crafting predators that were not just physically adapted but mentally adapted to their environment. The darkness was making them smarter. The team brought back genetic samples from multiple individuals and conducted the most comprehensive analysis yet. What the genetic sequencing revealed was almost impossible to process. The lions had not just diverged from surface populations, they had been deliberately modified, not by humans, but by something. The genetic markers showed evidence of rapid, targeted mutations in specific regions of the genome. Regions controlling vision, hearing, skeletal density, oxygen processing. It was as if nature itself had been editing these lions, removing the genes necessary for surface life and installing the genes necessary for underground existence. Dr. Okonkwo's theory, published in a preliminary report that sent shockwaves through the scientific community, was that these were not merely adapted lions. They were engineered lions, shaped by 12,000 years of intense environmental pressure into something entirely new. The time frame was impossibly fast for such dramatic changes, unless, he suggested, there was something about the cave environment itself that was accelerating the evolutionary process. Perhaps the particular mineral composition of the rocks, perhaps something in the water, perhaps the absolute darkness itself was somehow triggering genetic changes at a rate far faster than natural evolution should allow. The theory was controversial. Some scientists dismissed it as pseudoscience bordering on the mystical, but others found it compelling, particularly those who studied extremophiles and organisms that thrived in impossible environments. Life, when faced with pressure, seemed capable of adapting far faster than conventional understanding suggested, and these lions were the perfect example of that principle. But the most terrifying discovery was still to come. On day 8 of the second expedition, the team documented an interaction between the pride and something else living in the darkness. Motion sensors triggered in a chamber the team had designated as the Western Passage, an area rich with cave-dwelling mammals and frequented by the pride. When the team arrived with thermal imaging equipment, they found a scene that suggested a confrontation had recently taken place. The thermal signatures showed multiple large animals, far too large to be normal cave fauna. The shapes on the thermal imaging suggested predators, multiple predators that were not lions. The team did not approach directly. Instead, they set up remote cameras and monitoring equipment to observe what would happen next. What they documented over the following 3 days suggested that the underground world was far more complex, far more populated than anyone had imagined. Another predator, identifiable from thermal imaging and partial skeletal remains left after a kill, appeared to be a completely unknown species. The creature was large, possibly 3 meters in length, with a body structure that suggested feline ancestry, but with modifications so radical that it appeared almost alien. The remains that the team recovered for analysis showed skeletal structures unlike any known cat species. The teeth were different, larger, arranged in patterns that suggested a hunting style completely different from lions. The bone density was different, suggesting a different ecological niche. Most significantly, the evidence suggested that this unknown predator and the lion pride were in direct competition, and the conflicts between them were becoming increasingly violent. Deep in the darkness, 2 apex predators were fighting for dominance in an underground kingdom no human had known existed. The lion pride was not alone in the depths. They shared their world with something else, something unknown, something that was apparently winning some of the conflicts. On one occasion, the remote cameras captured thermal signatures that suggested a lion being driven away from a kill by the unknown predator. The speed of the encounter, the ferocity captured in the thermal data, suggested that this other creature was a formidable hunter, possibly even more adapted to the darkness than the lions. The question that haunted Dr. Okonkwo and the entire research team was simple but profound. If this unknown predator existed, how many other species, how many other civilizations of creatures were living in the darkness beneath the surface? How many unknown ecosystems were thriving just kilometers below human habitation? And what happened if they ever came to the surface? The team collected samples of the unknown predator, analyzing DNA with the fastest available technology. What came back was shocking. The creature shared genetic markers with both felids and something else, something that had no clear classification in any known animal lineage. The DNA suggested a creature that had evolved for such an extraordinarily long time in complete isolation that it had become something entirely unique, something that no taxonomist could easily classify. It was ancient, The genetic analysis suggested a lineage that might have diverged from known felids as much as 30,000 years ago. 30,000 years of underground evolution had produced something that modern science had no framework for understanding. The implications cascaded endlessly. If felids had been evolving in darkness for 30,000 years, what other lineages had diverged into the underground? What about canids? What about primates? What about species that had completely abandoned the surface world and built civilizations in the depths? The publication of Dr. Okonkwo's findings in the journal Nature sent shockwaves through the scientific community, but not in the way the research team had hoped. Within days, the paper was facing intense scrutiny, criticism, and outright dismissal from established researchers who had built their careers on the understanding of predator evolution. The central criticism was simple: the findings were too extraordinary, the adaptations were too complete, the time frame was too compressed, it violated too many fundamental principles of evolutionary biology. Dr. Richard Hartwell, a prominent evolutionary biologist from Oxford University, published a scathing response paper claiming that the data must have been contaminated or misinterpreted. He suggested that the team had either discovered a previously unknown population of trained lions, possibly escapees from some underground zoo or research facility, or had experienced some form of systematic equipment failure that had produced false positives across multiple measurement systems. The probability of all the instruments being wrong in exactly the same way, Hartwell argued, was infinitesimally small. Therefore, the instruments must be correct, and the interpretation must be wrong. But Hartwell's critique, while professionally devastating, could not refute the physical evidence. The biological samples were real. The DNA analysis was irrefutable. The video footage existed. The thermal imaging data was documented. The team had multiple independent measurements, all pointing toward the same impossible conclusion. Lions had evolved in complete darkness to become something fundamentally different from their surface cousins. What followed was a media firestorm that would define the next 3 years of Dr. Okonkwo's life. News networks around the world ran stories with headlines that ranged from sensationalistic to terrifying. Underground monsters discovered in Africa. Evolution's darkest secret revealed. What else is living beneath our feet? The public imagination seized on the discovery with a mixture of fascination and horror. The idea that an entire civilization of apex predators could be thriving in the darkness, unknown to science, unknown to humanity, triggered a deep primal fear. The response from cave diving communities was immediate and organized. Expeditions began forming to explore other cave systems, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia, where deep cave networks were known to exist. Some expeditions were scientific, properly funded and staffed with trained researchers. Others were amateur operations, poorly equipped and dangerously led by treasure hunters and thrill seekers, hoping to be the next person to discover a new species in the underground darkness. The caves became a frontier, a new realm to explore, and in humanity's perpetual hunger to explore the unknown, safety often became secondary. The first accident happened in the Tung Sao cave system in Vietnam, just 6 months after Okonkwo's paper was published. A team of 12 cave explorers penetrated to a depth of 700 meters, farther than had ever been officially recorded. They set up camp and began documenting the fauna of a massive chamber that appeared to be isolated from any known surface connection. On the 4th day of exploration, their communication systems went silent. A rescue team dispatched from the surface found the camp in chaos. Equipment was scattered. There were signs of a violent struggle, but of the 12 explorers, only 3 remained. The 3 survivors told a story that seemed impossible, a tale that the rescue team initially believed was the product of fear, darkness, and oxygen deprivation in the high altitudes. They claimed that something had attacked the camp in the deep darkness, something large, something that moved with predatory precision, something that had deliberately hunted them, separated them, and killed 9 of their companions in less than 40 minutes. The survivors described a creature with glowing eyes, massive teeth, and a body that seemed to shift and move in ways that didn't match normal animal behavior. The rescue team found blood, human blood, scattered across the chamber floor. They found broken equipment and claw marks on the cave walls that were several centimeters deep, gouged into solid rock with a force that suggested an animal of extraordinary strength and ferocity. They found the partial remains of 1 team member, partially consumed in a way that suggested predatory feeding, and they found massive paw prints, far larger than any tiger, far larger than any known predator, pressed into the soft soil of the cave floor. The incident was officially attributed to an encounter with an unknown large predator. The expedition was classified as a tragedy, a cautionary tale about the dangers of cave exploration, but the story spread through the underground diving community with terrifying implications. If there were predators in the caves, predators that could kill 9 trained explorers in less than 40 minutes, what did that mean for future expeditions? What did it mean for the safety of anyone who ventured into the darkness? Dr. Okonkwo's team had been aware of the risks all along. Their expeditions into the Mvuli cave system had been conducted with extreme caution, with safety protocols designed specifically for the possibility of encountering apex predators in an alien environment. But they had always maintained distance, always retreated when signs of aggression appeared, always respected the natural behavior of the animals they were studying. The Vietnamese expedition had done none of these things. They had ventured deep into unknown territory without understanding what they might encounter. They had paid the price. The second major discovery came through satellite imaging and geological surveys of the African cave systems. Researchers using advanced ground-penetrating radar discovered that the cave networks were far more extensive than anyone had imagined. What had been thought to be isolated cave systems were actually part of a vast, interconnected network that stretched for thousands of kilometers across Central and Eastern Africa. The limestone formations that created the caves were estimated to be over 300 million years old, meaning that the underground world had been evolving in isolation from the surface for an incomprehensibly long time. The implications were staggering. If the lions had been evolving underground for 12,000 years, and if they had diverged from surface populations, then how long had other creatures been evolving in these caves? The dating suggested that some of the limestone formations were old enough to have supported life for millions of years of isolated evolution in absolute darkness. The underground world was not a new frontier. It was an ancient kingdom, populated by creatures that had evolved since long before humans appeared on the African continent. Dr. Okonkwo's team conducted a detailed analysis of the prey species available to the underground lions. What they discovered suggested an ecosystem of astonishing complexity. The cave systems contained thousands of species, from microscopic bacteria to creatures measuring several meters in length. The biodiversity was staggering, more diverse in many ways than equivalent surface ecosystems of the same area. The darkness had not impoverished life, it had diversified it, creating an abundance of evolutionary niches that had been filled by creatures of extraordinary specialization. But the most disturbing aspect of the prey analysis was what it suggested about predation levels. The sheer abundance of prey was not consistent with a single predator population of lions. The caves could theoretically support dozens of large predator populations, each with numbers in the hundreds or thousands. Yet the evidence suggested only a handful of predators occupied the space, which meant one of two things. Either the predators were far more efficient at controlling prey populations than anyone had anticipated, or there were predators in the caves that had not yet been discovered. The third expedition, mounted in 2021, was the most ambitious and the most dangerous. It brought together over 40 researchers from multiple disciplines, along with cutting-edge equipment for exploring extreme environments. The team included geologists, biologists, paleontologists, behavioral scientists, and even astrophysicists, because someone on the planning committee had the insight that life evolving in absolute darkness might teach us something about life that could theoretically exist in other worlds with similar conditions. The expedition lasted for 3 weeks in the depths. What they discovered fundamentally changed the nature of the research and transformed it from scientific curiosity into something approaching existential concern. Deep within a chamber designated as the central hub, the largest open space yet discovered in the cave system, the team found what appeared to be a graveyard. Skeletal remains, thousands of them, scattered across the chamber floor in patterns that suggested deliberate arrangement. The bones represented multiple species. Some were clearly lions, identifiable by jaw structure and fang configuration, but many were not. There were skeletal remains of creatures that matched no known species, creatures whose bone structure suggested evolutionary paths that had diverged so radically from the surface that they seemed almost alien. Some of the remains showed evidence of age dating back hundreds of years. Some showed dating that extended back thousands of years. The graveyard was a record, preserved in bone, of the evolutionary history of the underground world. Most disturbingly, the arrangement of the bones suggested ritual. There were groupings that appeared intentional, patterns that could not be explained by random scattering or water flow. Some of the larger predator remains were arranged in circles around prey species' bones, suggesting something that might charitably be described as a funeral arrangement. The implication was profound and terrifying. These creatures had achieved a level of intelligence and social organization that included ritual behavior, that included what might be called culture. Dr. Okonkwo examined the remains with a sense of reverence mixed with profound unease. This was not simply an archaeological site. This was evidence of civilization, of ordered society, of behaviors that transcended simple predator-prey dynamics. He documented each skeleton, each arrangement, each pattern, with meticulous precision. And as the picture emerged, a theory began to form in his mind. The creatures living in the darkness were not simply animals. They were intelligent beings, possibly as intelligent as humans in their own way, adapted completely to an environment that had produced not just physical changes, but cognitive evolution. The team's behavioral observations during this expedition revealed interactions between the lion pride that suggested communication at a level far more complex than previously documented. There were what appeared to be hunting councils, where multiple lions gathered and made complex vocalizations before dispersing to hunt. There were what appeared to be teaching moments, where adult lions deliberately showed younger animals techniques for hunting specific prey. There were even interactions that suggested mourning, where the pride gathered around deceased members and made sounds that seemed to convey emotional content. One interaction in particular haunted Dr. Okonkwo for the rest of his life. The team observed a young lion, possibly juvenile, that had become separated from the main pride. The animal showed signs of distress, making high-pitched vocalizations that seemed desperate and fearful. Within 30 minutes, 3 adult lions appeared, responding to the calls. They retrieved the juvenile and carried it back to the main group. But the interaction was not typical predatory behavior. It was caregiving. It was rescue. It was a demonstration of social bonds and cooperative behavior that rivaled primate intelligence. The emotional complexity was undeniable. These creatures cared for each other. They grieved for their dead. They taught their young. They mourned their losses. In the darkness, removed from human civilization, removed from the influences of the surface world, they had evolved into something that possessed not just intelligence, but what could only be called culture, society, and possibly even morality in their own context. The genetic analysis of samples collected during this expedition revealed something even more disturbing. The lions showed evidence of not just physical evolution, but genetic drift that suggested controlled breeding. Over generations, specific traits had been selected for individuals with superior hearing, superior adaptation to darkness, superior hunting ability, had been bred preferentially. It was natural selection, yes, but it was natural selection operating at an intensity and with a direction that suggested some form of conscious choice, some form of deliberate husbandry. One researcher, Dr. Lisa Zhao, a geneticist specializing in population dynamics, theorized that the prides might be deliberately managing their own genetics, that adult lions might be making mating choices based on traits that benefited the group, that they might have over thousands of years deliberately evolved themselves into their current form. The idea seemed absurd, impossible, but the genetic evidence supported it. The question that emerged from all this research was simple but devastating. How intelligent were these creatures? And the answer that science was forced to confront was terrifying. They were intelligent enough to communicate complex information. They were intelligent enough to teach their young. They were intelligent enough to manage their own breeding. They were intelligent enough to organize hunting strategies. They were intelligent enough to mourn their dead. They were, in every meaningful way except perhaps abstract reasoning and language, comparable to human speech, equal to or perhaps superior to many surface predators in terms of cognitive capability. The public reaction to these discoveries was a mixture of fascination and fear. Documentary crews requested access to the cave systems. Governments began to express interest in the discoveries. Environmental groups raised concerns about protecting these creatures. And through it all, the question that kept being asked was simple and primal. Are we alone on Earth? Not in terms of human civilization, but in terms of intelligent life. And if these creatures existed in the darkness, undetected by human science until recently, what else might be out there? The fourth expedition, in 2022, brought news crews and journalists to the cave systems. For the first time, the public got to see footage of the underground lions. Television stations broadcast thermal imaging video of the creatures moving through the darkness. their massive forms silhouetted against their own body heat. The footage was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. These were not malformed freaks. These were apex predators, perfected by millions of years of evolution, existing in a world humans had never known existed. But the footage also brought unintended consequences. 3 days after the news coverage aired globally, a team of poachers entered the cave system. Their goal was clear and brutal: capture specimens of the underground lions for sale on the black market. Intelligence agencies later estimated that they intended to sell breeding pairs for tens of millions of dollars to private collectors and underground zoos. The poachers were well-equipped, well-trained, and utterly unprepared for what they would encounter. Of the 16 poachers who entered the cave system, only 2 exited. Both were severely traumatized. Both required hospitalization for injuries and psychological trauma, and both refused to speak in detail about what had happened in the darkness. Their accounts, fragmented and incomplete, suggested that the poachers had encountered not just lions, but multiple predator species, and that they had been actively hunted, separated from each other, and systematically eliminated. The creatures in the darkness had not simply defended themselves. They had hunted the hunters. They had understood the threat and responded with tactical precision. The international response was swift and decisive. The cave systems were designated as protected areas. Armed guards were stationed at known entrances. Governments passed legislation making unauthorized access to the caves a criminal offense. The underground lions became protected. Some would argue more carefully protected than many surface species. But the question that haunted everyone who knew the truth was simple. Did the lions need human protection, or did humans need protection from the lions? By 2023, the existence of the underground lions was no longer a secret confined to the scientific community. Every person on Earth who had access to news media knew that intelligent apex predators were living in caves beneath the African continent. The initial shock had evolved into a complex mixture of wonder, fear, and existential uncertainty. But what the public did not know, what had been carefully kept from mainstream discussion, was the true scope of the discovery. The lions were not unique. They were not even the most advanced species living in the darkness. The fourth expedition had made a discovery so profound, so shocking, that the scientific community had spent an entire year debating whether to reveal it. The discovery had come almost by accident. A team member, Dr. Michael Adeyemi, a geophysicist, had been mapping the thermal signatures of the cave system when he noticed something anomalous. There were chambers, large chambers, that showed no thermal signature consistent with natural geological formations. Instead, they showed evidence of modification. The walls had been deliberately smoothed. The entrances had been deliberately enlarged. The chambers had been deliberately shaped for purposes that had nothing to do with natural cave formation. The team investigated cautiously, understanding that they might be approaching evidence of something they were not prepared to comprehend. What they found was a structure, a deliberate constructed structure, built from limestone blocks that had been cut, shaped and fitted together with precision that suggested advanced engineering. The structure was a wall approximately 3 meters high and extending for over 50 meters through one of the major chambers. Behind the wall was a space, deliberately enclosed, deliberately sealed. The purpose of the wall became clear when the team carefully disassembled a section and examined what lay beyond. They found tools, not primitive implements, but sophisticated instruments made from bone and stone, shaped with precision that indicated understanding of leverage, force distribution, and material properties. They found containers, carved from single pieces of limestone, designed to hold liquids. They found what appeared to be artistic representations, carved into the stone walls, depicting animals, depicting hunts, depicting what might charitably be described as symbolic thinking. Most significantly, they found evidence of fire, ancient fire pits, lined with carefully arranged stones, surrounded by ash deposits, that carbon dating suggested were less than 500 years old. Fire, the ability to create and control fire, was one of humanity's most defining characteristics, one of the fundamental markers of civilization. Yet here, in the darkness of caves beneath Africa, creatures that were not human had discovered or developed the ability to create and control fire. The implications were so staggering that the team took weeks to verify the findings before even allowing other researchers access to the site. Dr. Okonkwo himself made the journey into the deepest parts of the cave system to examine the evidence firsthand. When he emerged, he was a changed man. In the years since his initial discovery, he had maintained a kind of scientific detachment, had treated the lions as subjects of study, but standing in front of evidence of tool use, evidence of construction, evidence of art and fire, something shifted in his understanding. These were not simply intelligent animals. These were intelligent beings, possibly intelligent enough to have developed what might be called civilization. The technology level suggested in the evidence was primitive compared to modern human standards, but that was only because human technology had advanced exponentially in the last few hundred years. By objective measures, the creatures in the darkness had achieved a level of technological sophistication that indicated abstract thinking, planning, cooperation on a massive scale, and the kind of cumulative cultural development that defined civilization. The question that emerged from this discovery was not scientific but philosophical. If these creatures had developed civilization, what did that mean for human understanding of intelligence? What did it mean for human understanding of consciousness? And most crucially, what did it mean for the relationship between surface civilization and the civilization beneath? The research team began a detailed study of the structures, trying to understand the timeline of development. What they found suggested a progression. The oldest structures showed evidence of being roughly 2,000 years old. The most recent structures were less than 500 years old. In that time frame, the creatures had gone from building simple walls to creating complex architectural spaces. The rate of technological development suggested an intelligent species that was actively building and refining civilization at an accelerating pace. One of the most striking findings was evidence of what appeared to be writing. Not human writing, but symbolic representations that showed consistency and structure, suggesting a form of communication more sophisticated than simple pictographic representation. The symbols appeared on multiple surfaces throughout the excavated areas, always in contexts that suggested record-keeping or information transfer. If this was truly writing, if these creatures had independently developed a written language, then they had crossed one of the fundamental thresholds of civilizational development. Dr. Okonkwo's team brought in Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in cryptography and symbolic communication, to analyze the symbols. What Chen discovered was stunning. The symbols showed patterns of repetition and variation that were consistent with linguistic complexity. She theorized that they might represent a phonetic or semi-phonetic writing system, where different symbols represented different sounds or concepts. If this was correct, then the creatures had not just developed writing, but had developed writing independently of human influence, without knowledge of human writing systems, purely as a result of their own cultural and intellectual development. The implications cascaded endlessly. Intelligence was not unique to humans. Consciousness was not unique to humans. The ability to create culture, to transmit knowledge across generations, to develop technology and art and philosophy, was not unique to humans. Somewhere in the depths of the earth, another intelligent species had evolved these capacities entirely independently, and they had done so without knowledge of humanity, without influence from human civilization, in isolation so complete that they represented an entirely separate evolutionary pathway. But there was more. The cave system showed evidence of not just one but multiple construction phases, and the most recent structures showed evidence of far greater sophistication than the older ones. Stonework became more refined, chambers became more elaborate, and most disturbingly, evidence suggested that the structures were becoming larger and more complex, suggesting that the civilization was growing and becoming more advanced. The creatures beneath the earth were not stagnating, they were developing, they were evolving technologically, just as humans had. The team's behavioral observations during this phase of research took on an entirely new significance. What had previously been interpreted as simple hunting behavior now looked like warfare. The conflicts between the lion pride and the unknown predator species they shared the caves with showed evidence of strategy, of deliberate tactics, of what might be called military operations. The creatures were not simply hunting for food, they were fighting for territory and dominance, just as human nations do. One observation in particular struck Dr. Okonkwo with the force of a revelation. A group of the underground lions had cornered several of the unknown predators in a chamber with only one exit. Rather than rushing in for a kill, the lions had positioned themselves carefully, blocking the exit, and then made sounds, complex vocalizations that seemed to communicate to the trapped predators. The trapped creatures had remained still for several minutes, and then without any physical confrontation, they had retreated deeper into the cave system. It appeared, impossibly, that a negotiation had occurred, that one intelligent species had communicated with another intelligent species, and had come to some form of agreement without violence. The watching researchers had no explanation for what they had witnessed. They could only categorize it as unprecedented, as suggestive of a level of cross-species communication and understanding that seemed to border on the miraculous. The final shocking discovery came in 2023, 3 years after the initial expeditions into the Muli cave system. Ground-penetrating radar, improved and refined over the years of study, detected something that fundamentally changed everything. Beneath the limestone cave systems, deeper still, at depths of nearly 1,000 meters, there were more structures, far more structures, massive structures, chambers that dwarfed anything previously discovered, arranged in patterns that suggested city planning. The team realized with creeping horror that what they had been studying was not the entirety of the underground civilization. It was merely the surface level, the caves closest to the surface, the areas where creatures descended when they ventured up from the depths. Below, in the absolute depths of the earth, there was something far larger, something far older, something far more developed. Permission to excavate deeper was granted by the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2024, and the team began the dangerous work of drilling access shafts to reach the deeper levels. The drilling alone took 3 months, operating 24 hours a day, penetrating through solid rock to reach the chambers below. When the first shaft broke through into the space beneath, what emerged from the opening was a breath of air that came from nowhere in the modern world. It was cool, it was dry, it was ancient. The first team member to descend into the depths was Dr. Okonkwo himself. He had led this journey from the beginning, had staked his reputation and his career on the reality of these discoveries. It seemed fitting that he should be the first to see what lay beneath. The descent took 20 minutes, lowering himself through a shaft cut through solid rock, descending through absolute darkness illuminated only by his headlamp. The beam of light seemed almost fragile against the immensity of the darkness surrounding him. When his feet touched the stone floor of the chamber below, Okonkwo's breath caught in his throat. The chamber was not natural, it was constructed. The walls were perfectly smooth, perfectly carved. The ceiling rose 40 meters above his head, and in every direction, carved into the walls, illuminated by his headlamp, was architecture, structures built within the larger structure, geometric arrangements that suggested not shelter but something far more sophisticated, government buildings, religious structures, community gathering places. The chamber stretched for kilometers. The beam of his headlamp could not reach the far walls. The structures extended in every direction, suggesting a city of underground architecture that dwarfed any human city of comparable age. The stonework was exquisite, far more advanced than the surface structures the team had already documented. This was not primitive construction. This was the work of creatures with centuries of engineering knowledge, with understanding of architectural principles, with artistic sensibilities that expressed themselves in stone. Most devastatingly, Okonkwo found evidence that the city was not abandoned. There were bones scattered throughout the structures, bones from creatures that had lived here. There were tools scattered as if recently abandoned. There were what appeared to be sleeping areas, carefully constructed alcoves within the larger structures. And when Okonkwo's thermal imaging equipment finally arrived via drone, it revealed something that made him sit down in the dust of the ancient stone floor and contemplate the magnitude of what he was seeing. There were thermal signatures, recently active thermal signatures. The city was not abandoned, it was inhabited. Right now, at this very moment, the city beneath the earth was alive with creatures going about their daily existence. They were there in the darkness, living in civilizations that rivaled human achievement, and they had no knowledge that humanity had discovered their existence. When Okonkwo emerged from the depths and reported his findings to the team, the reaction was one of profound shock. They had expected to find evidence of past civilization. What they had discovered was evidence of present civilization, an intelligent species currently thriving, currently developing, currently existing in a parallel world beneath the surface of the earth. The implications were so profound that the scientific community struggled to process them. The governments of the world convened emergency sessions to discuss the implications. The existence of an intelligent non-human species on Earth fundamentally changed everything. It changed how humans understood their place in the world. It raised questions of rights, of coexistence, of whether humans had any ethical obligation to interact with or protect this species. It raised questions of security. If this intelligent species decided to expand upward, what would happen to surface civilization? But Okonkwo had a different concern. He had spent enough time observing the underground creatures to understand that they were not aggressive to those who did not threaten them. In fact, based on his observations, they seemed to avoid surface creatures when possible. The discovery of human presence in their world would change that. They would perceive humans as a threat. And if an intelligent, technologically developing species with the physical capabilities of apex predators decided that humans represented a threat, what would be the consequences? The decision was made to keep the full extent of the discovery secret. The world was told that a new species had been discovered, that it was remarkable and worthy of study, that it would be protected, but the world was not told the full truth. The world was not told that an intelligent civilization existed beneath their feet. The world was not told that humanity was no longer the only intelligent species on Earth. The world was not told that they shared their planet with creatures that could match human intelligence, creatures that had developed civilization independently, creatures that might one day decide to expand beyond the darkness. Dr. Okonkwo continued his work, now more focused on understanding the creatures, on learning to communicate with them, on preparing for the possibility that one day, perhaps in his lifetime, perhaps in the lifetimes of future generations, the creatures of the darkness and the creatures of the surface would make contact. The thought kept him awake at night. When that contact happened, what would the world do? And more importantly, what would the creatures beneath do? 5 years later, in 2029, something extraordinary happened. A team member, Dr. James Mbatha, who had been studying the vocalizations and attempting to understand the language of the underground creatures, made an astonishing discovery. One of the older recordings, made during the second expedition, contained what appeared to be intentional communication directed at the research team. The creatures knew, somehow, despite the team's best efforts at stealth, despite their careful precautions, the creatures had known that intelligent beings from another world had entered their domain. The vocalization, when analyzed carefully, appeared to be a greeting, not hostile, not threatening, a greeting, an attempt at communication. The creatures beneath the earth had been trying to talk to humanity, and humanity had not understood. The researchers had recorded the communication, had catalogued it, had analyzed it, but had not recognized it for what it was, until years later, when they finally looked at the data with the knowledge that intelligent communication might be possible. Okonkwo listened to the recording hundreds of times. The sounds were complex, layered with meaning that his ears could not fully process. But underneath the complexity, there was something unmistakable: intent, consciousness, the desire to communicate with another thinking being. The creatures of the darkness wanted to talk. They wanted to establish contact. They wanted to bridge the gulf between two worlds. The question that now faced the scientific community was profound and terrifying. Did humanity accept the invitation? Did they attempt to establish formal communication with an intelligent species they had only recently discovered? Did they reveal to the world that they were not alone, that Earth harbored not one but at least two intelligent species? Or did they maintain the fiction, protect the creatures beneath, keep the secret locked away in classified research facilities? The answer, when it came, was tentative and careful. Contact would be attempted, but it would be controlled. It would be scientific. It would be cautious. A specialized team was assembled, trained in linguistics, in animal behavior, in diplomacy and communication. They would attempt to establish contact with the creatures of the darkness. They would attempt to communicate with another intelligent species for the first time in human history, and they would do it knowing that the creatures beneath were intelligent enough to decide whether contact was welcome, intelligent enough to decide whether humanity posed a threat, intelligent enough to decide the fate of the world above. As Okonkwo prepared for the first formal contact expedition, he reflected on everything he had learned. The creatures in the darkness were not monsters. They were not demons or curses or harbingers of doom. They were intelligent beings, evolved through millions of years of adaptation to an environment that humans could barely comprehend, developed through their own cultural and technological evolution into civilizations worthy of respect and study. They had languages and art and philosophy. They had mourning rituals and celebration. They had conflict and cooperation. They were, in every meaningful sense, people. The terrifying truth was not that they existed. The terrifying truth was that humanity had nearly committed genocide against another intelligent species and called it wildlife protection. The terrifying truth was that if things had gone differently, if the first team to enter the caves had gone in with weapons instead of instruments, if governments had decided to eliminate the threat instead of protect the species, if any of 1,000 small decisions had gone another way, an entire intelligent civilization might have been erased from the earth before humanity even knew it existed. And as Okonkwo descended into the darkness one final time, his equipment configured for communication rather than observation, he wondered what would happen when the creatures of the deep finally spoke to the creatures of the light. Would it be the greatest moment in human history, or would it be the moment humanity learned that it was not the crown of creation, that intelligence and civilization were not uniquely human, and that sharing the earth with another intelligent species might force humanity to reconsider everything it thought it knew about itself? The darkness waited, the creatures beneath the earth waited, and humanity, standing on the threshold of a contact that would change everything, took a breath and prepared to speak to another world, a world that had existed beneath their feet the entire time, a world that had been evolving in isolation, a world that was about to collide with theirs in ways that no one could fully predict or control. The terrifying truth was not that the lions existed in the darkness. The terrifying truth was that this was only the beginning. Contact with the underground civilization would open questions that humanity was not prepared to answer. Questions about coexistence, questions about rights and territory and resources, questions about what happened when two intelligent species discovered they shared a planet. The caves of Africa held secrets that would redefine human civilization, and those secrets were about to be revealed. As the first words of attempted communication were transmitted into the darkness, Dr. Okonkwo understood that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The world would never be the same. The creatures of the surface and the creatures of the darkness would now face each other, intelligent being to intelligent being, and the outcome of that meeting would determine the future of both worlds. The darkness had been keeping a secret for millions of years, and now that secret was about to change everything.